If we are able to actually achieve some sense of solidarity, I think the means by which we fight, and one concept that we explore a lot through this podcast, and that I've learned a lot from Glenn Coulter and Leanne Simpson, is kind of this employment of indigenous Marxism in that. And of course, we say indigenous Marxism to mean, at least on the most basic level, a form of Marxism that accounts for land sovereignty. But I think in employing that as well, I was wondering what your thoughts are on how we can intentionally recenter women and queer people in sort of an indigenous Marxist action, because, anybody who's read anything of Marx knows that he's not always the best when it comes to women and queer people. So indigenizing that sort of political theory, how can we also, understand indigenizing to mean bringing women and queer people back in as we decolonize that theory?
I think part of it is, that is an excellent question. That is a great question for Leanne Simpson. She's going to have so much to say to you about that. Let me give you I'll give you a little flavor on it. You can decide if it's helpful or not. And I'm open to this not being that helpful. I think part of it is movements require leaders. One of the things that I've tried to think about in the way that we organize is, if whatever you're bringing to the table, you have to kind of also have a sense of, you've got a table of organizers, you've got a table of other leaders, you've got a table of people who all have strong opinions, who are ready to contribute. There is a requirement of leaders to also look around that room and say, what are we missing? And that's one of the things that I think, this is actually true of nationalism, has done very poorly. And Marxism, obviously, for a variety of reasons, Marx himself struggled with exactly these questions. And I think what's required of us is to think about the ways in which we take a moment and say, when's the last time we've heard from, and then enter into a perspective that we would be richer if we knew of it, if we had it presented to us, and say, we're going to take a moment and we're going to think about, we're going to make a space for that person to speak should they wish, or someone who can articulate that position. But we can also then take a moment for us all to think about what would be required for us to bring that perspective to this table today. And I think that that's one of the things that would help in some of these moments, is if leaders who, and I say this as a person who loves to talk, who take a moment and say, enough from me. Let's hear from, and then insert the person that we haven't heard enough from yet.
Yeah, and I think this whole idea of making space for perspectives that we are not hearing is where someone like how you've described yourself comes in a really good way, because when you talk about trying to be the person who can work with anyone, we often, when we hear someone describe themselves like that, the first thing that you kind of think of, or that I at least kind of think of, which I didn't think of when you said it, by the way, but just that sort of thinking is just this sort of white dad perspective of well, let's just try and find common ground, which always ends up just kind of defaulting to almost this common sense perspective, where the person who really gets the short end of the stick is the person who is farthest from the social or political or societal norms, right? But I think that we need to reinterpret that, or perhaps define it differently, as someone who can work with anyone is really important in this scenario, as the person who is, keeping track of the perspectives that are not involved, because just simply being what perspectives am I not hearing, puts us at risk of just co-opting people from those communities in the same way that the Canadian government co-opts Indigenous leaders, where we only pick out the ones that we want to hear, where, if we had straight leaders only picking out the queer people that align with their views the most and are going to want to talk to people who have more radical perspectives, or the same with women, So I think it's it's really important to have someone who feels like they can work with anyone and bring people in who will say things that they might not like and be okay with that, you know? And I think that also comes back to not eating our own or trying not to do that and kind of opening that dialogue up to actually have critical thought as a community.
I agree. And, part of it also is that question of values, too. You can design an institution, you can design a movement in a way that can be inclusive and rather can be ideologically tightly bound. Let me frame it like that. You can design a movement or an institution that can be ideologically tightly bound, that only a few people get in. But you can also build those boundaries out. It doesn't mean that those boundaries don't exist. Like there's certain things that are just no-goes. So for a lot of folks, if you want to have a movement, a broad Indigenous movement that's sort of trans exclusive, that's probably a no-go. That's going to have a really hard time.
Yeah.
But if you want to have a movement that includes Métis people, you're going to have to be open to a variety of different orientations to Métis history. But at the same time, I say that, you also have to have space for Métis people to be able to participate with their own boundaries, which means that, you actually have to be a Métis person to be part of these movements. You know what I mean? Like, so I want to be able to say that boundaries, what that means is boundaries are elastic, and these movements and these institutions and these political activities that we have to be in conversation with what those boundaries are. And I think that that's healthy. And I think that the other thing is that I want to encourage two things. I want to encourage folks to say, well, what is the Native perspective on, right? CBC and CTV and all of these media outlets, they love that question. What do Native people want? What a tired question. Yeah. And it actually still circulates, And then the other thing is we have spokespeople who are out there filling that gap. And that I don't love either, which is say, well, Native people don't like X. What I want to hear is people to say, there's a diversity of opinion. And here's a couple of the different ways that this community is thinking about it. That doesn't lend itself well to a 8-second hit on the nightly news. But it does lend itself a little bit better to a print source, right? So trying to think about the way that we communicate our political diversity of views is, I think, healthy and enriches us. People's concern is it can be used in a way to say, well, they don't know what they want, so we don't have to pay attention to them. There's a balance between those two things. Because if there is no clear sort of sense of direction, I think that is actually a fair concern that people that leaders often will offer. I have to be able to tell them something of what we want. It can't be all this different things. We do actually have to have a program to be able to offer. But that's, I think, is the role of good leaders, is to be able to find the ability to articulate that program. It's also, I think, the ability of leaders to have a team in which the people around them, the people at the table, the people who are helping them make decisions and who are part of the decision-making process, not everybody wins everything all the time. Which means that if something is being articulated, there has to be space in our institutions, in our movements, in our political organizing for people to be like, oh, God, I don't agree with that, but, I'm going to try and find a way through this. I say that, in part because there are moments in which I, in my own political activity and professional activity, have had to say, this thing that we're planning to do, I'm not the right leader for it. I need to take a step back, and we need to find someone who is the right leader for this activity. And so you can't, we also have to try to cultivate leaders in our training programs in universities and in our political organizations. We have to cultivate leaders who see the thing that's being done as bigger than themselves and say, listen, if everybody wants to do this thing and I'm opposed to it and I can kind of tell that it's not for me, I need to take a step back to make space for the next person to lead, to give you the quality of leadership that you need. Now, that doesn't mean I'm out of the fight. It just means that the role that I was playing as a leader has changed. And you need someone who's going to advance this in a way that the collective is sort of aware of, and that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay too. And so I think it's partly I want to encourage people to have a high level of fluidity about the way that these things start to unfold.
Mm-hmm.
So it is possible to balance those desires to have a movement with a goal, with a method that you like, and with peoples whose perspectives are included, and decision making that is not unanimous, but also tries to build consensus, tries to build a common position, but that not everybody gets everything that they want. Like those things sort of, you can kind of see, start to stack one on top of the other in order to create something that I think is attuned to our values and is making decisions in a way that people, even if you don't agree with, this is the authority question, even if you don't agree with, you're like, yep, they went through it and I don't share that view. I would have made a different decision, but I'm open. But I acknowledge that that's the direction that we're going to be going in for now. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. And being okay with revisability. That's the other thing. Like, these things can come up under different circumstances, and we might arrive at a different decision at that point.
And that whole idea of having leaders with small enough egos that they can just step back when they feel like they're not the best person to do the job. I mean, I feel like some of our provincial rep leaders could learn a thing or two from that.
I agree. That is a great question. How do you teach people to do that? And I think it's about surrounding them with women.
Yeah.
Women and old people.
Mm-hmm.
To say, this is not about you.
Mm-hmm.
You're just one part of this.
Mm-hmm.
Your job is to get this as far as you can get it and then hand it off to the next person who might get it further or take it in a different direction. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay. This isn't about you.
Yeah.
The organization has to be something that exists independent of a person, and that's I think the quality of great leaders. And I've worked with really great leaders. I've worked with terrible leaders.
Mm-hmm.
I've tried not to be a leader myself. I kind of see myself as like one of the people that does a lot of supporting. That's usually the role that I take, and I'm very happy to do it. But we've got work to do to train people to be the type of leader who can check their ego at the door, can be told that they're not doing the right thing, can be able to hear things and be open to being wrong. Right? Those are the qualities of a leadership that bring people along. And also, but leaders who also can thoughtfully push back and say, I don't share that view, and I think this is why we should go in a different one. That's part of this decision-making process. And I'm a big, I don't know. I just came out of an era where you didn't get everything that you wanted.
Yeah.
There wasn't room for purity.
Mm-hmm.
And, you had to balance being right with being with winning. That was always tough.
There's something there's a joke in here somewhere about two half-breeds having a conversation against purity.
Yeah, I agree. Totally. Yeah, that's great.
But I think what you're saying about just to bring it back to what you were saying about the boundaries in which we would operate within and identifying those boundaries, I think it's important to note that identifying those boundaries through critical thought and analysis is a key point rather than just trying to identify boundaries by common sense, like even like the examples you gave where like if someone were to try to start a Métis trans exclusionary movement, you're not going to get there with critical thought and analysis. You could start a movement that includes Métis people, which was your other example, and identify that boundary through critical thought and analysis. Right? So boundaries aren't a bad thing in the case that we are actually having communal critical thought about what they are and how they function.
Absolutely. I think that's right. And key to that is the appreciation that this is also a nationalist movement.
Mm-hmm.
There's a nationalism that's at play, which means that there are people who are inside the community, the nation, and there are people who are outside the nation. And that's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
We're living in a bit of an era of inclusion, and inclusion can run amok. I'm a big fan of there are elements of balance that are required for these things, and there are reasons to exclude.
Mm-hmm.
There are reasons to exclude other folks from these sorts of things, and we have to be able. And this is the point about where the rubber hits the road on our relationship with First Nations folks. There's spaces that Métis people shouldn't be in,
Mm-hmm.
and there's spaces that First Nations people should not be in, Métis spaces. That's okay. We also need spaces where we can come together, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I mean about like these things have to be happening in a variety of different contexts where we're able to talk across, we're able to appreciate difference, but also talk across it to commonality. And that's true for the Métis movement as well. Like we have like the elephant that lives in a Métis room is that we have identity problems. We're not the only ones, but we seem to be the ones where people park their confused identities or their self-serving identities. We have to be attentive to that, and that doesn't mean that everybody's in. And it means that there will be decisions about who gets to be a member of this nation.
Mm-hmm.
And the movement then also is built from that, right? So those are all questions about boundaries, and that's okay. I'm not a radical inclusionist.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that inclusion is balanced against something. Inclusion is balanced against exclusion in political contexts for nationalist movements like ours.
Yeah.
Right.
And no, I agree with you. There are certainly reasons to exclude, and with the way that Métis identity is kind of becoming more wishy-washy right now, if you will, that's definitely something that we need to think about. And one thing that really kind of spoke to me when I was speaking with Elder Tom McCallum for this podcast was just our connection to our Korean Anishinaabe cousins and ancestors, and just how much of our culture is inherited from them. And that, oftentimes we're trying to be culturally distinct by making our culture all about sashes and fiddles. But what makes us culturally distinct is really what we've inherited from our Korean Anishinaabe family members. And that's a huge role of it. And there is some of it that is just the same as what they do. But that's also the key problem, as with all of these organizations and groups that are popping up that are saying being Métis is just having a First Nations person in your family and European people in your family, because what if that, like, you're not of the same culture if your indigenous ancestor is Pueblo and your European ancestor is Austrian. Like, that doesn't suddenly make you a part of this culture. That doesn't mean that you can't maybe reconnect with the culture that you came from, but there's a lot of problems that are going to arise from that. And it's honestly, it is a true matter of cultural appropriation, you could say. And certainly harms us culturally and politically.
I agree. And, I try to bill myself. First of all, I am deeply in debt to the work of Chris Anderson, Adam Gaudry, and Jenna Dise, who have been, I think, the leaders, and Daryl LaRue, one of our settler allies, who have been leaders on trying to deal with exactly this. And I have benefited so greatly from the ability that I don't have to start by talking about, well, this Métis person was born 9 months after the first fur trader arrived. It was garbage when I was a kid, and it's garbage now. That's not how people come to be. Mm-hmm. All of the things, like when I teach this in my class in university, I always have a unit on Métis stuff. When I teach Introduction to Indigenous Studies and I teach Intro to Poly, I've done both of those many times now. And I always have this unit and I say, think about the things that make your community a community. Mm-hmm. Maybe some part of it is ancestors, but like there's a whole bunch of other stuff that gets thrown into that pot. Your culture, your heritage, your laws, your politics, your language, the fights you've had to fight together, the fights you've had to fight between each other. Like, none of that is about finding somebody in your in your family tree and then working backwards to build yourself an identity, you're not part of anything. You're part of something that might have been happening a long time ago, but then there's this massive gap for you. And so like I try to kind of be open. I understand where the struggle that people have with these questions, and I understand how emotional it is that people are searching for systems of belonging. I just, as one of my colleagues once said, you might be a Native person. You're just not one of our Native people, like you might be Native. You're just not Native here or, that sort of thing, or to this people. But so don't use our language and our terms, like people rolling out sashes in Cape Breton Island and like Red River carts in the Maritimes. Like this is just so cringy.
It's like
so cringy.
Cosplaying as Métis.
Actually, there's a real element to that, isn't there? Cosplaying. Yeah, that's right. Every day's Halloween. For some of those folks. So I try to build myself as like I understand where this is coming from. I'm also part of the nationalist tradition because of where I'm from, how I grew up, and and my training. All those things kind of come together to make me really feel like these nations mean something, and they're not something that you just add people to because you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, that sort of thing. So we are part of a community, and there's divisions in that community, but it's still a community that shares a history and a collective history, not just like of individuals running around at the same time in roughly the same place. This is a political history that includes organizing and all the rest of it. So, and that's the distinction between someone, and again, another colleague once said, I think it was Chris Anderson said this at a public talk. It's okay to find Native people in your family tree. Good for you. That's great. That's kind of neat.
Yeah.
It can stop there.
Yeah.
Right? You're not trying to reimagine yourself now and your entire family tree because you might have found someone. And that's Daryl LaRue's contribution. Is sometimes they just imagine that they've found this person.
Yeah.
Right? And they're trying to build out a rights regime with this is the other, I'll say one more, this is the other point and we can move on from this topic because I don't want to belabor this too much. The dead giveaway for me often is that these folks are re-engineering themselves from a very distant past, kind of almost to the chagrin of their family members frequently. And they're far more interested in their rights than they are in their responsibilities. And I say this also to folks in the West who are legitimately discovering that they have connections to the Métis Nation. Good for you. That's great. You need to focus on your responsibilities before you chase after your rights. And I think that's always my advice is what are your responsibilities in this moment, as opposed to running around and talking about now I have these new rights. The rights are actually not as important as the responsibilities, and that's the other thing that I think lots of Métis people have also forgotten.
You need to pursue community and be in community with people before you jump on the rights bandwagon.
Absolutely. And sometimes your responsibility, and this is true for me too, is to show up and to tread carefully and tread gingerly, not on eggshells, but to appreciate that you're a learner, that we are all learners, and that you're doing a lot of listening, right? There's a lot of Métis people that all of a sudden they've got a card and man, they're doing a lot of talking.
Yeah.
Right. And they're doing a lot of asserting, and they're doing, and it's cringy. It's a dead giveaway, and you've forgotten that your responsibilities are a lot more important than your rights.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that, there's a big difference between going way back in your family's tree, like you were saying, and finding a random Native person on there and then reinventing yourself around that. And then also the strange predicament that we're in right now where there has been 1 to 2 generation gap of loss of culture due to residential
For
schools.
sure.
And
racism.
That's, that
institutionalized racism.
Yeah. Because it's one thing to just be, kind of allowed to practice your culture. Like, it's not illegal anymore. And to be bringing that back, I think all of us know people who have done that. All of us have family who have done that.
Absolutely.
And that is different when it's like that direct line. Like, for example, like my great-grandmother went to residential school. My great-grandfather didn't, but they were too afraid to raise their 2 white passing kids as openly Métis. So they grew up not knowing about it. They found out later in life. I grew up always knowing, and I was lucky to. But that is like reclaiming.
Absolutely.
It's not reclaiming when it's some rando that you've never heard of before that is way back, and now you're reinventing yourself around that with no community connection.
I'm with you 100%. And let me just put another spin on this. Our nationalisms normally, and we would expect them to, have provisions that bring people home.
Mm-hmm.
It's key to how we think about ourselves. It's key to both our thinking about what we look like in the future, but also how we respect the journeys of our people from the past. Our nationalisms have provisions and have space to bring people home. And you're right, that's not the same thing as drawing a boundary around people who are reinventing themselves kind of in a thought experiment or in some sort of like genealogy take-home project. Those are different things. And I'm with you absolutely. And this is actually, I was just working on yesterday before I came in and came out here to visit you. I was working on this section of the book where I was trying to say, okay, who do I think Métis people are?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I'm testing and I'm trying to think through is we have a lot of challenges in these questions of identity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our identities are complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's a difference between the challenges and the things that we faced collectively and individually, and you're talking residential schools, absolutely. Institutionalized racism, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time in which no one would rent to you in the city of Edmonton if you were a Métis person. It drove the creation of a housing cooperative that my colleague Natalie Kermoyle has been studying brilliantly. Those are challenges. That doesn't mean your identity is complicated. Like, our identities are actually not that complicated. They're laden with challenges.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of thing that I'm playing with a little bit. And I reserve the right to change my mind about that because I'm just at the early stages of it. But I'm just starting to play with that notion.
Yeah.
Because I feel like one of the things that we often do is when we have these conversations, someone has to say, but it's all complicated, which is sort of like a catch-all for being like, I think this, but maybe someone thinks something different. Yeah, which is a great orientation to have. That doesn't actually mean that identity is complicated, right? Challenging? Yes. Complicated? I'm not. Yeah. At the moment, I'm not convinced that it's complicated.
Complicated is more like, I don't want to talk about it anymore.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, sort of akin to like writing things off with common sense in a way, in terms of our identity, and as we move towards wrapping up here, one of the last things I wanted to talk to you about is something that Métis people really build their identity around, that you have critiqued, and it's just this sort of way that we look towards great Native men of the past and how we really almost like deify Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont. And hey, don't get me wrong, I love those guys. Like they did a lot of great stuff. Louis fumbled the bag a few times. He came around in the end. But yeah, it seems like a lot of our nationalism is built around these almost godlike figures now.
For sure.
And you have a lot of criticisms about that. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so much so that we put them in bronze, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we put them in bronze and on pedestals and, oh boy. Here's my take on this. So I spend a lot of time thinking about 19th century politics, because I think they're important. And I think that they set up a trajectory that we're still living with today. So it's really important for me to understand what we were trying to do and what we did well and what we did poorly. There are a lot of political actors, important folks from their community at play through several key moments in our history in the 19th century, 1870, the one that I'm most interested in, and 1885. There's other ones that happen on either side of that. Jean Taillé has written a little bit about them in her book, The Northwest is Our Mother, and folks should go and take a read of it. Jean Taillé also is, as she will tell you, the great grandniece of Louis Riel. I don't see the world that way. I see. Listen, I understand the desire for a nationalism, particularly for a people who have been like attacked so systematically for so long, like Métis people and other Native people have, to have heroes, have people who fought the good fight and won or at least lost well. Right? It was a good lose.
Yeah,
I get that. There is a risk to doing this, which I am nervous of, which is you de-emphasize the breadth of political thinking and the breadth of political actors in our political activities. The other component of this that I think is key is because we then focus on these few Native men, is that we then also are not asking ourselves, who have we not heard from in this? And sometimes there's a little bit of work that's required to go back and hear from these other people who are contemporaries of Riel and Dumont and Brady and Norris and these other really important Métis folks. And I think that that's some of the work that we don't do because we just feel like, well, we've already got these folks, right? We've already heard from the great people. I don't really need to. Or you just feel like it's not something, it doesn't occur to you, right? And that's a normal thing too, that these things sometimes these things don't occur to us. So we end up then kind of boiling down and distilling our political discourse in a way that agrees with Riel or that aligns with Riel or aligns with Dumont or aligns with these other folks. And my big concern is that we're poorer for it, right? As opposed to seeing these great men, and they are great. Like I agree with you, but these are political actors among many. And what I've learned is that there are a lot of different ways that people try to approach the same issues that they were working on for a variety of reasons. Some of it being just personality and charisma, and other parts of it just being historians latching on to something that they've got good data for or good sources on. They're the ones that we talk about. And we don't think about the entire community of Plains diplomats, Native Plains diplomats, who are running around trying to ensure that this whole region doesn't explode. Yeah. And Riel, honestly, is not that helpful in those moments, right? Riel is, it's like this is partly the other thing. I did not, like, I know I'll talk about this in the book. So if people want more detail on this, that'll be, I think, the opening of chapter 2 is going to be, my family are not Rielists.
And use code Daniel Voth for 20% off.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There's no code. Also, we probably should just give the book away for free. I mean, it probably would be a better way to get people to read the book. Also, because no one should buy it. And the book is a ways away. But like, this is what it's working on is trying to figure out a way to talk about. Like, I did not grow up in a family that told stories of Riel the hero. I grew up in a family that told stories of Riel the Johnny-come-lately and the guy who did not respect the variety of entrenched, community-rooted opinions in Red River and beyond. And so my family were, like, the Halletts, and the story that I have about Billy Hallett was that he and everyone else were running around trying to hold this place together and build bridges and be collaborative. And eventually engages in what was quoted in one source as a word-slinging match. She engaged with a word-slinging match with Riel, and Riel throws him in jail. This is like, so I do not grow up with the same stories that a lot of other Métis people have about Riel. I don't grow up with the stories that he's crazy or he was a traitor. That was something I got from high school and junior high.
Mm-hmm.
But I went into those being sort of already not like super suspicious of Riel from the stories that my family tells about that time. So that's the risk, is we focus on these folks and we're poorer for it. We don't understand the breadth of our own intellectual diversity. And we think that in order to be a good Métis person, do I have to think like this? Like maybe that's what's required of me? And we've lost that being a good Métis person is about you thinking for yourself, right? That's what being a good Métis person is about, right? And not being told.
Yeah. But I think, and it's interesting the way that we do idolize them. I feel like we forget sometimes that they were just people who made decisions, and even like those good decisions, like, because there's, just about every Métis person across Turtle Island will show up for some sort of Riel Day celebration. I would say less than 10% of those people would be willing to engage in even a fraction of the revolutionary action that he was engaging in.
Oh, for sure.
And that's such a strange disconnect. And I feel like it's just like this view of him as this like almost unreal martyr that's like just like an interesting parable story. And it's like he was like spearheaded some action that I would like to see more of today.
I agree. And he took some significant risks. He also negotiated some of those diplomatic moments poorly, and those things are the harder pieces to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a realist. Let's imagine that I am. Like, he was the only Albert Braz wrote this fabulous book, and he's got a new one coming out. Wrote this fabulous book, and one of the lines I think in it was, the only thing that Riel's thought was ever consistent about was that he hated Canada. Métis people contemporarily have this weird love for Canada that I don't like. I go to some of these things and they want to sing the Canadian anthem, and I'm just like, but they also then want to like idolize Riel. I'm like, that's actually one of the few things that Riel was consistent throughout on his entire life, was that he was deeply distrustful of the Canadian project. Back
to Batoche, where they open with the national anthem, and then the RCMP comes through.
It's
like, that's who we were fighting. What's happening?
What is going on here?
It's weird, yeah.
And they got the Canadian flag up there. There's like a both sides thing to the Batoche like graveyard.
Yeah, it's like did you forget?
What is happening here? And like, so there's this like weird internal dissonance that exists for Métis people in their minds that I have never fully understood. And I don't like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I grew up deeply critical of the Canadian state for a variety of reasons, many of them rooted to my family's stories of what colonialism means. But like it's just so weird that in a lot of Métis the minds of Métis people, there is this desire to want to love Canada so deeply, but then also love Riel so deeply. Like, those two things actually can't live together.
Yeah,
that you make them live together is a bit of a feat of your own mental gymnastics.
Like, one actually murdered the other.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So how this happens makes very little sense to me. I mean, part of it, I'm just sort of thinking out loud about this. Like, part of it is like, lots of people have contradictory thoughts, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it's important to make space for that. But I think it's also important to point out people's contradictions and ask them to be a bit more meditative about them. And also to say, I don't share your view. I don't share your view that Canada is great, and so is Riel. Actually, I think both of them are pretty problematic. And that's okay. And that's okay too.
Yeah.
That's okay too. And also, if you want to be a realist, fine. Take the good parts of that, like you said, like and it ended up being a fairly strong organizer of the folks who were working the boat brigades and that sort of thing, and like whipped them into a fairly effective military force in short amount of time. So what about that? Like,
but yeah, that a mutual love for Canada and Riel is, I feel like, maybe the epitome of this common sense thinking, where it's like, love Riel and everything he stood for, and I also love Canada because, you know, I can't hate, that's where I'm from. It's and it's like, I encourage you, if you think that way, to think critically about it for more than 2 seconds, because that is just the penultimate common sense nonsense of just like things that cannot coexist. But on this thought of this kind of like hyperfixation on Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont, and again this general great Native men of the past sort of thing, I do think often also causes us to just ignore and not really be curious about the roles other people had, and in particular that would be, to bring it back to our overarching theme here, like women and queer folks. And the thing is even like you were saying earlier, like a lot of the historical documents in the archives, like we just don't really have those voices represented. But because we put these great Native men of the past on such a pedestal, we just take that, we already have all that we need, and we're not really digging in anymore. And one of the first times that I really kind of noticed that was Gregory Schofield put out a poetry collection. I think it was called Louis the Heretic Poems. I remember seeing him do a live reading at the Vancouver Louis Riel Day event a few years ago. I would have been like 2019 or something. And he read a selection of poems that were all written imagining the perspective of Marguerite, Louis Riel's wife. And I thought it was so interesting. It was just something that seemed so ridiculous that I'd never really thought about before. And it was just these like heart-wrenching poems of even things like Marguerite at home alone with the kids, like thousands of kilometers away, just waiting for the time that she knows her husband is about to be hung, you know, like things like that. And then you kind of dig into all these other stories of what all the Métis women were doing at the time, just suddenly when that curiosity is sparked, and you hear all these things about, at the Battle of Batoche, right? Like the women were back looking after the kids while it was mostly the men out fighting, but they're not only looking after the kids, they're also making bullets in real time out of scrap metal and things like that. Like that battle could not have been fought without that sort of thing happening. Or even after Louis Riel was captured, and you hear about Marguerite takes her kids and goes and hides in a cave for like a week or two, waiting to hear back about what's happening. And they're like living off the land in a cave, hiding, you know, like it's just this crazy survivalism and these really just interesting stories. And and not viewing these great Native men of the past as just people who are a piece of the puzzle in the overarching story of our people, kind of like you would say, kind of robs us of these really interesting perspectives that we are better off to have in our circles. Yeah, I agree. I love that. I hadn't read those poems. I'll give you one more for folks to kind of look up and reach out on. Yvonne Chartrand, who taught me how to jig here in Vancouver, she did a choreographed piece about, now was it Marguerite or Sarah? Because Riel's got a sister, Sarah, I think. I can't remember. So, yeah. Anyway, I think it was, maybe it was Marguerite, but she did like a choreographed dance, an interpretive dance piece about Sarah or one of the women in Riel's life. And it was fabulous. It was actually one of these pieces that was part of she did this some years ago. And it was one of the pieces that really got me thinking about, where are these women and what work have we done to go and find them? But also then to kind of talk to the women today, like thinking about, we're just talking about this, I'm realizing I haven't actually given you a lot of like the women you should go and take a look for. Marilyn Dumont, you know, like another brilliant poet.
So people are doing interesting work to bring out these gendered perspectives on what have been dominated as male-centric stories. And I don't think they're doing it necessarily as a critique. I think Yvonne Chartrand here in Vancouver right now, I think she would describe herself in our conversations. I think she's a fan of Riel, like that makes sense to her, and for a variety of reasons. I think what she's just doing is like enriching her relationship with that story by talking about the art of the women around him. And I think that is an appreciative critique. That is an appreciative critique. And I think that's also some of the work that other folks are doing. Marilyn Dumont's work at the U of A has also been about thinking about where the stories of Métis women in these moments. Brenda McDougall's book centers Métis women. Her contribution in the church chapter in the Contours of a People book is also about the role that women are playing in all of these questions of the hunting brigades. And so people are doing it. They are reaching for those moments. Yeah.
The last recommendation I'll put out there that is similar to these other ones that we've talked about, in terms of being an appreciative critique is, have you ever heard of Women of the Fur Trade?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. It's for those who don't know, it's a play, but it's also been published the script has been published as a book. And I read it recently, and the author, Frances Conkin, came into my class that I read it for. I believe she's Anishinaabe. My apologies if I'm wrong on that, but it's about 3 women, an Anishinaabe woman, a Métis woman, and a white woman who are all in a room together, and they are existing in the 1870s, but in this weird liminal space, and but they all talk with modern slang. Have you read it?
A student gave it to me this term to read. One of my students in my intro to Indigenous Studies, Avalon Short, shared that with me, and it's very cool. It's
hilarious. I love it, and it's just like the whole idea that the Anishinaabe woman has actual history with Louis Riel and has mixed feelings about him. The Métis woman is in love with Louis Riel and writing him love letters. The white woman is in love with Thomas Scott and writing him love letters. And then I believe it's the Métis woman who actually ends up meeting Riel and Scott later on in the play. And it, they're fine. I mean, like, Thomas Scott is obviously a piece of work, but it's like both of them just end up not being quite what they thought they were. And like, Louis is like almost like this, like, portrayed as this kind of like himbo, like it's just like and it's just, and it's funny, and it's like this interesting mix of like of humor and serious critique, and that just like challenges you to look at these historical characters that you deify and actually think of like they probably weren't exactly like you think they were. And even just humanize them a little bit. So I think that's just another great example of it.
And artists are leading the way on this, right? I don't actually know where that quote is that comes from, like, our people will sleep for 100 years, and our artists will be the one to wake them up or lead them away. I don't actually know where that's from. I did spend, like, I don't know, a little bit of time at one point looking for where that came from, and I don't actually know. But it is actually, like, artists are always in a nation the folks who are offering interesting critiques and interesting engagements in ways to help us break the way we think about things. And we should embrace that. That's a richness.
Yeah. I mean, speculative fiction is doing a lot for our political ideology right now, I think. I mean, you even engaged in it, right? In your piece, Order Up. Such an interesting one. I never imagined Howard Adams in that scenario, but it works really well. But I think that kind of brings us to the end of our conversation today. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on, or any final thoughts?
No, this has been super cool. And, it's nice to have a moment where Métis folks kind of get together and kind of just chat about these types of questions, because we don't often have opportunities to do that for a variety of different reasons, and so this is a great opportunity to do it. And I'm so happy about the Sickle and Sash podcast. Like, this is so cool, and I'm a big fan. And this has this is also the kind of stuff that we can take into our classrooms and have students listen to and then comment on and say, what do you agree with? What do you not agree with? What would you, how would you answer some of these questions differently? And that's rich too. Like, it's a wonderful, wonderful resource. And so I'm thrilled that you're doing this, Josh. This is really, really cool.
Thanks. I really appreciate your support on it. You know, I'll give you one final anecdote, because it's kind of nice sitting here with you having this conversation. Feels like it comes full circle a little bit, because I remember the first time that we met would have been while I was in Glenn Coulthard's Indigenous Marxism class in like 2020 or 2021, so everything was over Zoom. And I was, I believe I was presenting on Order Up, and then you joined our class, and you were having this whole chat, and then you and Glenn were going back and forth a bit at the end. And I remember just thinking, like, that class and all of Glenn's work opened me up to this whole world and introduced me to Howard Adams and everything, and you, and so I'm sitting there, and I am hearing you come on our like Métis guest in the class to talk about Howard Adams, and then I'm asking you questions, and then Glenn wraps up the class, and he's like, all right, Daniel, next time you're around, let's go grab a glass of wine together, or something like that. And
I think it probably was beer if it was Glenn.
and I was like, oh man, I want to join for that. That's so cool.
Can I come?
I was like, this is such a niche group of people that I've ended up in conversation with. I was like, this is so nuts. So it's wonderful to have you on this podcast a few years later and just have some time to visit. So thank you very much for coming out.
I agree.
Yeah, I think we'll call this podcast, this episode, Going Back for Whiskey with Daniel Voth.
Yeah, that's right. I like it.
Well, thank you, everyone, for listening today. Thank you for coming on, Daniel. We'll see you on the next episode. Merci.